The role of non-government organizations, NGOs. For many decades, the World Resources Institute has assisted leaders in both the private and public sectors in making sound decisions with respect to practices that affect our environment. Here is my interview with WRI's Vice President for External Relations Robin Murphy, from the organization's headquarters in Washington, D.C. Craig Shields, do you want to begin with a mission statement for the World Resources Institute, for people who may not know too much about you? Robin Murphy, we work at the intersection of environment and human needs. WRI's mission is to provide analysis, research and recommendations that will help advance sound environmental decisions. And those are decisions made by leaders in business, leaders in government, leaders in fellow NGOs, non-profits around the world, in academia and elsewhere. When we talk about how we work at the intersection of people and the environment, what we're talking about is that there are human systems on this earth, we being the predominant species. And then there are natural systems. And while we've exerted a fair amount of control over some natural systems, we'll never exert control over all of them, though we are having an impact on them. And what we try to do here is to look at and figure out how we can have them work more in balance with one another so there is sustainability for people on this planet. And this means digging into the data and determining how these systems can be altered, calibrated, and rethought, so that we can deal with a burgeoning population, with climate change and so many things that are coming toward us. We help address all these issues in rational ways that are equitable and sustainable. CS, that's wonderful. How are you funded? RM, we are a non-profit organization, and we receive funding from 4 sources: individuals, foundations, governments, and corporations, and the proportion varies from year to year. A couple of years ago we had a much larger proportion of corporate grants. The pie has thankfully gotten bigger, but now it's more government grants. So it varies from year to year. CS, okay. It sounds like an important mission. Let's discuss it in the context of renewable energy. Where do you see your institute's activities as they apply to moving to renewables? RM, our point of view on this is of course not to pick and choose. There are a lot of possibilities out there in terms of renewable energy, and of course the wedges have defined a great deal of what's possible there. Our work is in helping with public policy that will encourage the best use of renewables as they're developed. Some have unintended consequences, and so we have a role in pointing out with empirical evidence how various approaches or solutions stack up in terms of their environmental impact, in the short and long term. CS, to the end of recommending the right course to policymakers? RM, yes. CS, I see. One of the reasons I ask is that I've spoken with people at the Audubon Society and the Wilderness Society and so forth, and that's pretty much uniformly what they say. Yes, we're in favor of renewables, but no, we're not in favor of blindly tearing up wilderness where you could have done the same thing 100 miles away where there's already a human footprint. So that's the type of thing you're talking about, I presume. RM. That's precisely what we're talking about. What may appear to be the perfect solution may not have been thought through, and there may be unintended consequences or things that really haven't been taken into account. CS, how would you say that the trajectory for renewables should be different in developing nations than it is in the developed world? RM. Very often the people who rely the most on clean ecosystems are the ones who have the least access to decision-making about them. WRI is concerned about the unintended consequences of development. Large-scale development decisions are being made, building dams and other things like that, without sufficient thought being given to the cascading consequences, to the environment, to people, to public health, to the quality of water and the quality of ecosystems. There are so many people who are affected by these mega decisions that are made, and they can be very blunt instruments at times. They can be as well-intentioned as possible, but they may not have taken into account the vicissitudes of governance, for instance, of corruption, of geography, of economics. There is a whole host of things in which we have expertise where we feel we provide a valuable contribution. CS. Let me ask you about Copenhagen, which, by the time this book is published, will be old news, albeit probably not very positive old news. But the reason I bring it up is that ironically, the people in the developing countries are going to be most affected by a cause that they had nothing to do with. In other words, the hardest hit, the most easily displaced, the most easily flooded and beset by famine are the people who had the least to do with this problem in the first place. Do you think that's true, and if so, what does WRI think about that? RM, we do think it's true. It's painfully obvious. The people who have not contributed to global warming, who've not had industrialization, will suffer from the direct consequences of it. The floods in Bangladesh, the people who live on the Maldives Islands and other places are not putting out tons and tons of carbon. There are a lot of people aspiring to have a better life, however that's defined, with at least security and comfort and shelter. And so yes, it's a huge concern. Many people call for environmental justice. The statistics don't lie about it. We've measured per capita emissions, and when you know the United States is at a certain level of 20 or 21 and the average Chinese is 4 or something, there are huge inequities. You do begin to look at this as a number of people in the religious community and elsewhere. It's not just scientists and policymakers, it's people who have a real concern about basic human equity. It also presents huge complications. You have a lot of things that are baked in, that are very difficult to reverse after decades and centuries of history, out of habit and cultural norms, and so these are some of the huge barriers, changing frames of thinking. One of them is the value of ecosystem services. For a long time we had the luxury of being extractive and we could kind of take whatever we wanted. Well now, how do you go about dealing with limits, and do so equitably? And how do you do it so that economies and individual businesses can thrive? I mean, this is not an anti-market or anti-capitalism concept at the root of things. But how can you introduce those kinds of better sustainability and a different way of thinking about ecosystems and their health so that people and economies can thrive? CS, that's an excellent question. Could you tell me more about ecosystem services? RM, they are just simply air and water and trees and the respiration of oxygen and the whole carbon cycle. There was a thing called the Millennium Assessment, done under the UN umbrella, and they took 24 major ecosystems and assessed them, literally like a traffic light, red, yellow, and green. Most of them unfortunately came out red, meaning degraded. Yellow meant under stress. And green was healthy. And we've picked up the mantle of this Millennium Assessment and have used that as a kind of template to put together a number of reports that we've disseminated to businesses, to municipalities, to mayors and to others to make them more aware of the value of ecosystem services. Coca-Cola learned this the hard way. It takes 7 gallons of water to make a gallon of Coke. And so they have to be located in places where there is an enormous amount of water and there's huge discharge. And a number of years ago, they went crosswise with the Indian government and got in a lot of trouble over there, but they now consider themselves a water company. They're a soft drink company, but they have to look at water and water supplies and water sources. Otherwise they can't do business and they can't produce the kind of product that takes this into account in terms of the health and vitality of ecosystems for everyone's well-being. You make a pressure point here or you destroy something here, it can have a cascading effect that can cost you more in the end, down the road, unless you've thought it through beforehand. Here's another example. The city of New York a number of years ago was about to spend literally billions of dollars to build a huge water treatment plant outside of the metropolitan area. And somebody pointed out that actually if they bought up huge amounts of land on the upper Hudson, where there's still forest and simply preserved the forest area up there, that the natural system of keeping the water pristine and not dumping into it or allowing development along the shores would allow them to have a clean water system coming downstream into the city. So they made the decision instead to pay landowners to hang on to it and to keep it in that natural condition because it's already a natural conditioner. CS, great stuff. Where do you focus most intensely to bring about a fair and positive change? RM, well, we can make it all happen. I have to say that we do take on the issues that we feel are the largest and contribute what we can to them. And that was a very deliberate decision from the very beginning. In the early years of this place, in the mid-1980s, climate change and ecosystem services were the two main things we selected, and we're still focused there. By no means do we feel we have the lock on everything, but we try to find the areas where we can get the most purchase, the most traction. Putting out academic papers is nice, but that can get you nowhere. How can we find the levers that will make change? Who are the champions who'll make change? For instance, the leaders of business who do have this kind of foresight. And they don't see it from an altruistic point of view. They see it from a market point of view, a shareholder point of view. CS, maybe you can give me an example of that. Are there cases where, through your work, you've gone to one or more business leaders and said, look, here's something where we can all win? RM, I'll give you two examples, Craig. One started around 1998, I believe. And it's the Greenhouse Gas Account Protocol. Back then, some businesses and other leaders were beginning to see that they were going to begin to work in a carbon-constrained world economy. And so how do you measure emissions? If you can't measure it, you can't make any adjustments. And so, WRO with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is based in Switzerland, a fabulous group, and Arthur Andersen, which is what it was at the time, got together and got our experts around the table and said, how do you set up a FASB, an accounting system? We want something that can be generally accepted and credible and standardized so that a ton in India is the same as a ton in the US. A ton in an auto plant in Japan is the same as an auto plant in Italy. So you have standards of how you go about measuring greenhouse gas emissions. And over time, this has become the norm. It's the standard now. It's generally accepted and used throughout the world. And our people here are now drilling way into the weeds, because that's what it's come to in terms of how you begin to measure things that are esoteric or arcane, or frankly that are just new processes that people haven't thought of. For instance, throughout your supply chain, how can you account for greenhouse gases among your suppliers? How do you put in land use? How do you account for deforesting a place and determining how much you're upsetting or allowing more emissions to go into the atmosphere when you've just cleared several thousand acres in Indonesia? The greenhouse gas is a technical contribution that I feel is also actionable and practical. That is the sweet spot of what WRO tries to do, to come up with something big, to work with partners on it, because we can't solve it all ourselves, and then start to implement it and get it out there so that it takes root. The second example is the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, USCAP, a group of 35 or so organizations. 7 of them are environmental groups and the rest are Fortune 500 companies throughout a number of sectors. In auto we have Ford and GM, in energy we've got PG&E, Duke, and Florida Power and Light. In chemicals we have Dow and DuPont. In extractive industries we have Rio Tinto. This whole thing came about when my boss Jonathan Lash and Jeff Immelt at GE had become friends. John helped them think through their Ecomage thing years ago. They really felt that getting federal law written, public policy at the federal level, would benefit from more than just hearing about the science from environmentalists like us. They asked why we don't work together and make recommendations that pull together the scientific aspects of this with the practical implications for business. How is it going to have an effect on an electric power company or automobile manufacturing or a chemical company like Dow? What will it do in terms of supply chains, shareholders, employees, the whole range of things? They've been working now for about 4 years in putting together this group, and they have produced 2 very public blueprints that have been presented to Congress. This is all online. I can send you the links. You'll see lots of working papers and lots of meetings, all this, frankly transparent. I wonder if this has ever taken place before in the history of the United States, where you had this kind of an incubator working alongside Congress. It's completely volunteer. Nobody asked them to do it, except they just all decided they'd get together and do it. CS, while at the risk of appearing rude, I would point out that corporations get together or work singularly to influence Congress all the time. It's called lobbying. What's the difference here? Our answer is that it's called capitalism. We've been accused, publicly by senators, of being pigs in a trough, and I can see how some people will look at it that way. I guess the point of view that we have is that it's not about individual companies. There are so many sectors. The oil companies are in here too, there's BP and Shell and others. There are so many sectors that represent trillions of dollars in equity, hundreds of thousands of employees. It's not some small little crowd. To critics who say you're just in it for yourselves, frankly there are plenty of others who could join if they want to or be part of this kind of a process. We just happen to kickstart it. And nor do we feel that we have all the answers. There's a lot of argument around cap and trade, for instance. We just simply have the point of view that changing markets is the way to go in this, rather than a carbon tax, which is so prone to political manipulation. When you create new markets, they're pretty hard to change because that's self-interest and they have a self-regulating effect. From an internationally competitive point of view as well, we have to get moving on this. These CEOs at USCAP constantly say this. They say this publicly, that they are holding up all manner of investment because they don't know which way to go. They want to know what the playing field is, what the boundaries are, what the rules are. The federal government sets the rules and then there's everyone getting into the fray. I'm straying a bit from your question, but mind you, this is pure capitalism. CS, now I understand more about what you're saying. Let me ask you about subsidies. Some people say, about corn ethanol for instance, that if we hadn't done this thing at the behest of a few extremely powerful senators in the Corn Belt, we'd all be a lot better off. Where does WRI stand on things like this, and promoting truth and transparency? We really try to approach it from a scientific standpoint. We have an institutions and government program, and they have a thing called the Access Initiative that they run throughout the world. And the main focus is working with a lot of in-country civil society organizations and other NGOs on how can you get more transparency in government. How do you get more participation in decisions that directly affect people, not giving away timber concessions, not trashing villages, etc. And so from that standpoint, it's taking it from the scientific analysis and assessment point of view and then asking how we can provide the kind of information and the kind of levers that will help make change. When it's things like ethanol, these things are highly political and there are often special interests involved. That's nothing new, of course. What we do is try to connect the dots and to say this was an investment that was made. Here's an array of other things which would have had less deleterious consequences, and here's an investment that would have much greater promise or fewer environmentally damaging consequences. So it's always about analysis and verifiable technical background research that we can do and bring to the table. CS, okay, so what you're saying is that, though you're not directly involved in the political process, you try to make this thing so obvious that, if corruption will occur, it will be forced to do so under the glaring light of scientific evidence. You can't keep it from happening, but you can make it pretty damned obvious. RM, yes, exactly. In fact, we spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill. We have a staff member who does that. We take our stuff to anybody who is interested in the subject. Because again, we feel like this kind of information analysis and synthesis is power. And if you're going to make an argument, you really can base it on credible evidence. We don't have a membership like a lot of other organizations do, and sometimes I wish we did. It gives you a lot of power and a lot of clout because you have a constituency. But we don't have a constituency. 0 members. And so it has to rely on the credibility of our work, which is peer-reviewed, outside-reviewed, etc., before it's ever gotten ready for prime time. That's the contribution that we can make and the value that we have. CS, well, thank you, Robin. This has been everything I hoped it would be. RM. Thank you. I'm glad. For more information on this contributor, please visit http://2greenenergy.com/ renewable-energy-facts-fantasies/